All right, let's get right into it. We spend so much time planning for a change, right? We build the strategy, we design the new systems, we map out all the processes, but what happens after all that, when people have to actually live with the new reality? Well, that final, supercritical stage is called the transition, and honestly, it's where even the most brilliant plans can completely fall apart. So today, we're going to break down exactly how to manage it.
And I mean, this quote from William and Susan Bridges just hits the nail on the head. A change, that's an external thing. Think a company merger or rolling out new software. But a transition, that's the messy, internal, psychological journey people go through to get their heads around the new situation. And that, right there, is almost always the toughest part of the entire process.
So here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to start by really defining this perilous final stage. Then we'll introduce a classic, super useful framework for getting through it. We'll dive deep into the first two critical steps, unfreezing and navigating the change, and then we'll wrap up with a pretty dramatic cautionary tale that shows you exactly what happens when this stuff gets ignored. If you're studying for a certification, you'll want to pay close attention to this structure. Okay, let's start with what we're calling the final, perilous stage. This is that moment of truth. It's when the change stops being just a concept on a PowerPoint slide and it becomes real life. Up until this point, all the consequences feel like they're way off in the future, maybe easy to ignore. But during the transition, suddenly it's concrete, it's unavoidable, and it feels incredibly personal.
And it's so important to see the distinction here. The transition isn't the change itself. It's the psychological fallout from the change. It's that period of time where everybody has to consciously let go of the way things used to be and figure out how to adapt. And this is exactly why it's the final and often the most powerful point of resistance you're going to face.
So how in the world do we actually manage this? Well, we need a mental map. And for that, we're going to turn to a really foundational concept in change management, Kurt Lewin's classic three-stage model. It's simple, it's elegant, and it gives us a really powerful framework for thinking about this whole process.
And here they are, the 3 stages. First, you unfreeze the current state. Think of it like melting a giant block of ice that represents the status quo. Then comes change, which is that messy, slushy, in-between period, the transition we're focusing on. And finally, you freeze the new state, solidifying those new habits so they become the new normal, the new block of ice.
All right, let's dig into that first crucial step, unfreezing the system. This is all about breaking through that deep-seated cultural inertia. I'm sure you've heard that phrase, but that's not how we do things here. That is the exact mentality you are fighting against, and it's the reason why even life-saving, brilliant changes can fail before they ever get off the ground.
So how do you actually do it? How do you melt that block of ice? Well, this framework, which draws on Kotter's model, gives us 5 really actionable steps. You have to start by creating awareness and urgency, making it crystal clear that staying put is just not an option anymore. From there, you have to constantly tie everything back to the vision, get your key stakeholders engaged, and finally build a powerful coalition of supporters who can help you lead the charge.
Okay, now let's move on to step 2. So you've managed to unfreeze the organization. Now you're in the transition itself. This is the messy middle. And for anyone studying for a certification, you've got to know this part. Mastering these 6 guiding principles is absolutely essential if you want to get through it successfully. So here are the 6 core principles we're going to talk about. It all kicks off with communication, explaining the reasons why and identifying the very specific changes. Then it's about making the problem feel real through first-hand exposure and creating safe spaces to discuss the transition. And finally, it's about supporting your people, helping them stay grounded emotionally and using structured transition meetings to keep things on track. Let's zoom in on a few of these.
This slide is just a brilliant illustration of one of the most important principles. You have got to be specific. Saying you'll be expected to do your jobs in a different way is so vague, and honestly, it's just scary. It creates all this anxiety. But telling someone, okay, you'll be in the office 3 days a week, and there's a required team meeting on Mondays from 9 to 11, that's concrete. That lets people actually plan their lives, figure out childcare, arrange for dog walkers. It moves the conversation from fear of the unknown to practical problem solving. And of course, the moment you get specific, concerns are going to pop up. And this is where the principles of discussing the transition and helping people stay grounded really come into play. How you handle these concerns is everything. The number one rule is to listen without immediately getting defensive. Sometimes people might overreact, not because of this change, but because of a whole history of badly managed changes in the past. You have to acknowledge their sense of loss. It's only by gaining their trust that you will ever get their commitment.
Now, what if people still aren't convinced? What if they don't see the need? Well, that brings us back to communicating the reasons, and there is no more powerful way to do that than through first-hand exposure. You can talk about market data and spreadsheets all day long, but having your team sit down and listen directly to an unhappy customer, that makes the need for change completely real and undeniable. It's pretty hard to argue with someone who's had a genuinely bad experience with your work.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of the theory. Now, let's look at what happens when this all goes horribly wrong. This is a real-world case study about a company called Integrated Heavy Industries, or IHI, and it's just a powerful, powerful lesson in the massive cost of ignoring the human side of change.
So here's the setup. You've got IHI, a Korean company with a very rigid top-down culture, and they acquire Combustion Engineering, a UK-based leader with a super independent, expert-driven culture. I mean, you can see the culture clash coming a mile away, right? IHI's goal was to impose its standardized processes. Combustion Engineering's goal was to protect its identity and its authority. It's a recipe for disaster.
And just look how quickly things went south. Day one, totally fine. You've got the formal introductions, the corporate videos, all that jazz. But by the very next morning, tensions were already sky high as the UK team started to realize just how much authority they were about to lose. And then came the breaking point. IHI demanded that the staff take a 5-hour training course on the IHI culture after hours.
And that demand was met with that classic, fatal line of resistance. A manager at Combustion Engineering tried to push back, saying his team was just too busy. So IHI suggested they do it after work, or maybe on the weekend. The response? That's not the way we do things here. And apparently the room just fell silent. The visitors from IHI left the very next morning.
And here's the key takeaway, the bottom line. The fallout wasn't just one awkward, tense meeting. 2 years later, the entire integration was officially declared a failure. That inability to manage the cultural transition, to unfreeze the system, and to navigate the human element proved to be, in the company's own words, quite costly.
And this really brings us to the core message of this whole explainer. You see, change management is often about designing the destination and mapping out the road to get there. But transition management, that's different. Its very first job is emotional. It's about convincing people to leave the comfort and familiarity of home, the old way of doing things. And if you can remember that, you will save yourself a world of trouble.
So, I'll leave you with this question to really think about. When you're in the middle of a big change, what's your real focus? Are you just managing the project plan, the timelines, the Gantt charts, and all the milestones? Or are you truly managing the messy, emotional, and absolutely critical journey that is the people's transition? Because the answer to that question makes all the difference in the world.